This is Chapter 10, Qualitative Interviewing for Applied Research Class Statistics. First, to start off, qualitative interview is an interaction between an interviewer and a respondent, where the interviewer has a general plan of inquiry, including topics to be covered. Before I go on, remember what qualitative research is. It's more in-depth, it's more categorical, it's quality, it's not numerical, it's more one-on-one interviews. So the interviewer might not have a specific set of questions to be asked in a particular order. When anybody does a qualitative interview, there are certain ways to do it. It can be done in a regimented question one all the way down, or it can be done more spontaneous, more answering what comes along, going with the flow. It allows researchers to really study more complex processes, or the hows of involving human perspective. It's thought of as purposeful conversation. Qualitative interviews can be the sole way of gathering data in criminal justice studies, and it allows the researcher to understand the subject's perspectives on a more in-depth level, and also can help gather firsthand accounts of their impressions and their lived experience. You get involved in their story. You listen to the participant. You follow along with their storytelling, and to help understand how they really feel about their roles and identities. You let them go off on a tangent and talk about something. Even if it's not a part of the interview, it might tell you more about that person than asking them a simple question. And the way that you schedule the interviewing process with the participants can have an impact on the results. So if you schedule a certain amount of time and you have to cut it off, that could change the depth and the interactive of your interview. Let's talk first about a more structured interview. The interview would consist of predetermined questions and answer sets, so it would flow a lot quicker. Structured interviews create standardized responses, like a standardized test. So you would ask, if you were interviewing a couple different ones, you would be asking them the same questions and giving them the same choices to choose from. A less structured interview would have some standardized questions, but may allow the interviewer to explore different themes and go into a different direction as those themes emerge during the interview. And the researcher can probe for additional information if it's not so structured. Now, an unstructured interview, one that has a more open style of interviewing, provides a more natural interaction. It's more of a conversation with the other person. You can do it in the form of an interview guide or in the form of a conversation, as I just said. And conversation is an informal chat with them where you're asking questions, you're responding to their responses. You might have a list of areas you want to cover within that conversation, but you let it go where it goes. Another type of interviewing technique is the focus group, where you have a small number of people that are engaged and they're all talking about the same topic. So you might ask questions, you might generate a conversation, and that will allow a discussion. And from those results, you can generate hypotheses, and you can show how opinions are produced and expressed. And it could be either natural or artificial groups, meaning that the natural group has an existing connection. They may have, let's say if you're looking at clients that have possibly at Alcoholics Anonymous. So everybody is there because they have an alcohol problem. Or you might actually bring a group together that you've selected and you want them to have a focus group. Either one works. Now, there's different kinds of interviewing techniques. And of course, you can, if you're doing a qualitative design, you can create one of your own. But some of the examples are the branch approach that involves having a main topic with questions that will branch off of your theme. The river and channel approach involves different streams of the questioning that may lead into a main objective with other streams diverging. So you might uh, construct your questions in just a certain way that you'll come back around to the main focus. And you can decide in what order to tell the story. You can deliver material that starts at the beginning and then progresses chronologically, or a framework that doesn't depend on time. Maybe you just let it just go from one to the next. It is best to create an outline of more categories of information you want to attain before you start writing. Just to have an idea of where exactly you want to go so you don't forget something and miss something important during your interview. And you can create categories and sets of topical areas. Have a question is worded can affect the response. And we talked about this. If you have a more negative question or a biased question, that it could elicit a certain response. You have to be careful because you don't want to ask a personal question or a question that might put somebody on the defensive and they shut down. So in other words, you want to avoid those double-barreled questions. A qualitative interview is all about being prepared. So you want to have these prompts available to you and have thought about them in advance in case you have respondents that don't answer the questions or maybe give you very short answers. So you want to be able to have thought about it ahead of time, a way to maybe clarify an answer, come up with some ideas through some research on some other ways to ask a question if it's not answered in the depth that you're looking for. Another area that you have to determine before your interviewing process, you have to decide how you're going to gain access to your participants for your qualitative interviewing. Are you going to be an insider or an outsider? Are you going to take part in the focus group and elicit the information? Are you going to be on the outside just questioning? How are you going to gain access to your participants? As a formal organization, you might have to identify yourself as the researcher, then make a formal request and receive formal approval. It's the same thing we talked about when you're asking for to collect data from a population, like the juveniles within incarcerated. You would have to approach the administrator, identify yourself, and explain why you're there, and receive permission, and possibly permission from the parents or the participants. It's best to use a 4-step process. So you have your sponsor, your letter, your phone call, and a meeting. So in other words, you sponsor meaning you hopefully have someone that refers you to the organization. Then you send a follow-up letter. You follow that up with a phone call, and then you set up a meeting. You want to gain access to information subcultures, and you can gain this by using a sponsor, or hang out where the subjects hang out, become a part of them. Say you were doing an interview on police officers, it would be difficult to get into that police subculture. But if you had a connection, or if you hung out where they did, that would probably be more difficult because it is such a closed subculture. But correctional guards, I bet you they go somewhere after work, or a typical place they like to wind down, and you might be able to gain access. You also might need to compensate to encourage participation. Now, when you conduct these interviews, you can do them in person, on the phone, online, or a survey. Of course, which one do you think would be the most beneficial? Face-to-face would be the most beneficial, and it is the most common. It's the most common because it does elicit the best information. Reflexivity refers to your subjectivity and the meaning you give to information. Remember, it's always important to remain critically conscious of your reflexivity, while you're conducting these qualitative interviews. During the interviews, you really need to develop a rapport with your respondents. You want them to feel comfortable with you. You want them to be able to answer any questions. And it can be done through informal conversation, or finding something you and the respondent have in common. A little chit chat before you get started, maybe a little introduction. Maybe even do it in spurts. You don't have to get all your information in one interview. Maybe you have a meet and greet, and then maybe you go on from there. You might need to conduct several conversations with the respondents, as I said. Active interviewing is a social exchange that allows for natural conversation and spontaneity. You want it to be a conversation. You want it to flow. You want them to feel comfortable. You don't want them to feel that they're on trial or they're being judged by what they say. You want them to feel as comfortable as possible. Now, focus groups, as we just talked about, is the small group that comes together, whether they already have something in common or whether they're a forced group. But you have to decide whether or not you're going to do a natural group or the artificial. And you need to be aware of group thinking and dominant group members. So if you're planning a artificial group, for instance, you want to make sure you choose the right people for your group. If you go in with a natural group, you may not know that until you start. So if, for instance, if you're doing information on a sensitive topic, you have to realize that the participants might get upset, might get defensive. If you're talking about abuse or you're talking about mental illness, it may not be something that they want to share around other people. They could hear somebody else, they could get upset, they could get into an argument. You have to be able to be ready for those situations. Something very important, after you have recorded all of your data, and usually you have taped interviews, you have to transcribe that dialogue verbatim. You cannot paraphrase it. You have to go word by word, and if they use a slang word, you have to put it in there. So it has to be verbatim. Also, after you return from your interviews, it's very important to write up your field notes as soon as possible, and that way you can add in any observations that you had, anything that you see as important. You then would manage your data through tables, charts, and other visuals. So this is putting all of your results into, putting all your data, into results to show to your reader. As I explained earlier, you might have, well, let's say you looked at different types of mental illness. So you take and say ADHD, bipolar, and schizophrenia. And so you would put them in a pie chart that shows all the different percentages. You also might sort them according to the stories that your participants gave you. And also something important, if you find something when you're going through your data that's irrelevant, maybe there was some discussion that didn't have anything to do with your topic, you can get rid of that. You don't have to report every conversation. You want to maybe pull in those light conversations. Also, too, you're going to want to code and process your data. So after and this is all has to do with just organization, putting like items together, putting them in different categories so that your data flows together and you can show the readers what you have found in a more organized format. The last thing to talk about is the quality and rigor in analyzing this data. In order to enhance the quality of qualitative analysis, you have to have established an audit trail. In other words, you have to keep track of everything. An important check is to look for negative cases that contradict the emerging themes, and also perform member checks where other researchers read the descriptions and verify the accuracy of the work. So you might want to have someone else go back and look at what you have done as well. And you also want to compare it to any other research that has been done on the same topic. But it's very important to, as I said, the audit trail. Keep your notes, keep them locked up. Don't destroy them, know where they are, and write your steps down from the time you started to the time you ended.